Good evening, everyone. It's always a good idea to try to put yourself in other people's shoes sometimes, not literally, but to think about and relate to what someone else goes through. That's a part of being compassionate. It's a part of just trying to be understanding and something that would be a good practice as we're no doubt familiar. But I want us to think about tonight in our study, of course, talking about spiritual things. What would we have done in some of the different situations we read about in the scriptures? As we can easily do that in thinking about other people in our life, people we've had contact with. There's certainly a lot of stories in the scriptures that we would do well to say, what would I have done if I was in that situation? Would I have been as faithful as some of these people? Would I have made the right kind of decisions? Would my faith have shown through, like we read about in so many cases in the scripture? And so we're going to be looking at some different Bible characters tonight and talking about some of those things. But as we read through some of these stories, as we talk about some of these situations, think about what these people are told. Think about the circumstances that they're living in, kind of what's going on around them. And then, of course, think about what they did. And then as we're talking about that, that should make us think about, well, what if it was me? What if I was in that situation? Would I have acted the same sort of way? So I hope it'll be a good study for us this evening. First of all, think about the story of Noah and the ark. Familiar story. No doubt we are all aware of this one, and it's not a difficult one to remember. But there again, when you think about the circumstances, you think about what's going on, it is a good one for us to be considering. Remember, in Genesis chapter 6, and the first part of chapter 6, we're told that in verse 5 that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and was grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land. And so we have that situation going on. And then we're introduced to this man named Noah. And Noah, we're told, finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. And we understand that Noah is different than these other people. And as you go through and read the text, verses 13 through 18, there's a lot of information there about what's going to happen, as well as what God was commanding him to do. The ark that was to be built, the dimensions, the specifications on how that was to be done, and details concerning that. And then in verses 17 and 18 of chapter 6, he says, Behold, I, even I, will be bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that's on the earth shall perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. And so he's given Noah some details on what's going to happen. And of course, the very last passage in chapter 6, it says that Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. And so you think about that situation, you think about what's going on in the world at that time. There's debate on whether it had rained before, whether there had been any sort of rain or floods or anything like that. I don't know what the answer is necessarily to that, but it's interesting to think about in light of what's getting ready to take place, and ultimately what we see Noah going on to do. God tells Noah in chapter 7 and verse 4 that after 7 more days, I'll send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. I'll blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I've made. Again, verse 5, and Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. And so that is revealing to think about in light of all the circumstances, what Noah goes on to do, to build this ark, to do all that God had said to do, as is emphasized. And so as we think about ourselves, what would we have done if we would have been in that situation? Would we have been among all the many people that weren't faithful to God, who were among the wicked in the world, among whom God said, you know what, I'm going to wipe everybody out because of people like you. Is that who we would have been? Or would we have been someone that's more relatable to Noah? That's a hard thing to think about with all the things going on, but I think it is worth us talking about and asking, would we have built that ark? Would we have taken those specifications that God had said and had done what God had said? Or would we have done something different? I know we don't necessarily have an answer to that, and nor could we say, oh, yeah, absolutely. But it is something good to think about when we are thinking about our faith, when we're thinking about our relationship with God. So would we have built an ark like Noah? It is something for us to consider. We talked about Abraham some in our lesson last Sunday night, but I want us to think about this again this evening in our study. As we mentioned last week that God had told Abraham to go to a place that he would show him, a place that he didn't know yet, but he was going to be shown where he was supposed to go. This is, of course, in Genesis chapter 12. But I want us to think about for just a moment, if we were Abraham, would we have traveled to an unknown land? Would we have been willing to pick up and go like we see Abraham doing? And I mentioned last week that that's a pretty big thing, to leave your family, leave your hometown where you've grown up, and just pick up and go. And not because you understand that you've got it all plotted out where you're going to pitch your tent on the other side there and know exactly what's going to happen, but just to know God said to go, and you don't really know where you're ultimately going to end up. But that's exactly what Abraham does. He does so on the basis of God and his word, and takes off and goes to the land that ultimately God showed him. That's a pretty big thing, though, even though it just is a matter of a few verses there in chapter 12. And also, if you look over in the book of Hebrews, as the writer talks about the faith of Abraham, it's a pretty good point through Hebrews, talking about the faith of Abraham. He says in verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And so you think about that situation and that scenario and how difficult that would have been. And it's hard to relate exactly to how difficult that would be. And yet we are forced to put ourselves in his shoes and think about that. Would we have had that kind of faith when God said, do this, go here? Would we have been able to say, okay, I'm going to go and pick up and do that? That's something that we should be asking ourselves in relationship to our faith in God. The next example is from our scripture reading in Numbers chapter 13 this evening. The story of Joshua and Caleb, again, not an unfamiliar story to us. Israel was, God was having Israel to go look at this land of promise. And we're told in the first few verses of chapter 13 of the book of Numbers that there were going to be spies that were sent out, and there were going to be one from every tribe. And so through the course of this, they pick out individuals who are going to go out and spy in the land. And in verses 17 through 20 of Numbers chapter 13, Moses tells them what they're going to be doing. Go into the Negev, go into the hill country, see what the land is like, what the people are like who live there, whether weak or strong, few or many. See what kind of the land it is it good or bad? See what kind of the cities, are they open camps or do they have fortifications? And, things like that. Go check it out. Go see how it's going to be. And when we get down to verse 25, the spies come back and report about the land. And they're talking about, look, the land is great. There are a lot of good things. It really is all that you said it was. Verse 27, it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and the fruit that's there is good, and all of this. Nevertheless, verse 28, the people who live in the land are strong. The cities are fortified, very large. We saw the descendants of Anak there. That's giants. We saw all this there, and then Caleb speaks up, as was our scripture reading tonight, and talks about, we should by all means go. We should go and take the land. This is what God has said. This is what he's determined. We should go and do this very thing. And so that's the conversation that's had there. And in the end, of course, it's only Joshua and Caleb that are standing up for doing what God had said. The other 10 spies are saying absolutely not. And as you look in the first 10 verses of chapter 14, the people are scared. They're mad. They're grumbling. They're complaining because these 10 spies brought back this report that said, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. We can't do this thing. There's no way. And so they're crying, they're complaining, they're talking about, why have you brought us out from the land of Egypt only to make us go through all of this? But this conversation continues, and Joshua and Caleb, they go on to say in verses 7 and 8, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. And so they make the case, look, if God's with us, this is going to happen. We can take this. It's going to be just what God says. And yet we know the story. Think about the pressure there would have been on Joshua and Caleb to just give in and be like the other 10. That was the way of the majority by far. There would have been probably some pressure to do that. Think of the fear that there is. Look at these people. Look how great they are. Their fortifications of their cities. How they're just going to wipe us out and all of that. Not taking into account, of course, God and what he said, but the fear that would have been involved. That fear from the 10 spies certainly transfers over to the rest of the people. But again, think about our own situation, and if we were there, what would we have said? Would we have said yes to what Joshua and Caleb said? Would we have stood up with them and said, absolutely, with God on our side, we can take it? Or would there have been pressure? Would there have been circumstances where we would have gone along with the rest of the people? Something to think about. The fear that was there, the people being scared of all that they were anticipating, and all of that, would have been very real. But how would we react to those sorts of things? Would we have stood with Joshua and Caleb and had said, yes, we need to go and take the land because God said that he's with us and that he's going to deliver them into our hands? And that's something very interesting for us to think about in relationship to our faith and going against the grain, going against the flow of what people often want to do. Are we willing to stand up for those things that are right, that God says is acceptable, or do we cave into the pressure of so many things that are around us? A very real parallel to be had with that particular story. But it is one good for us to ask ourselves. 1 Samuel chapter 17, the story of David and Goliath. Again, another familiar story. We talk about David being a shepherd, just a young boy. We talk about Goliath. He's over 9 feet tall. His armor, over a couple hundred pounds of armor. Just to say intimidating doesn't quite seem to do justice, does it? The kind of armor that he has, the head of the spear that he's carrying. I mean, all these things are so intimidating. And that's the way he comes across in the scriptures here in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Very intimidating. He comes down and he stands before the nation, and he says, like in verse 8, Am I not the Philistine? And you servants of Saul, choose a man for yourself. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. And he said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. He doesn't just issue this challenge one time, and that's that. He's out there every morning. He's out there every night. He's doing this for 40 days. And it's only, you can only imagine what that would do to the army of Israel, how intimidated they would have felt, how scared they would have been, how they're thinking, no, I don't want to go. Don't pick me. I can't do this. And how fearful of a situation that would have been. And I'm sure the Philistines felt like they had the upper hand, that, boy, if somebody will just come and challenge our guy over here, we've got it made. And of course, we know the story about David being in the camp and talking to different people around, hearing the Philistine and what he's talking about, and wondering what's going to be done with this. Why has nobody accepted this challenge? How come nobody's gone out here to face this guy? We're a part of Israel. We're God's with us, and we should be able to take care of this thing. And so he's asking questions. He's talking about, well, what's going to be done for the guy that goes through with this? You remember the confrontation with his older brother Eliab, and he's just outdone with David. You just came here to see the battle. Where's your few sheep that you're usually keeping? And so he gets on to him about that. Well, word gets around that David is asking about this, and he has this conversation with King Saul and asks him about this and says, don't worry, I'll go out. And Saul doesn't seem near as confident for some reason about sending this boy out there to fight not just a man, but this giant. And the situation is just so opposite from what would be ideal, of course. And so David gives the story about, I was out tending my sheep, and here comes a lion, and God delivered the lion into my hands. Same thing happened with a bear. God delivered the bear into my hands, and you know what? This Philistine's not going to be any different. It's going to be the same sort of situation. And so you can imagine when the Philistine, Goliath, hears about this and sees David. I mean, can you imagine what a mockery that would have been? Just, you're sending out this guy to face me. After it's been 40 days of all of this going on, you're going to send him out. And of course, we know the story. He picks up 5 stones. He has a sling. He can't really fit into the armor because he's so small, and the armor is too overbearing. And of course, he kills Goliath, hits him in the head with one of the stones, takes the sword of Goliath out of his own sheath there, out of Goliath's sheath, and cuts his head off, and is victorious with that. Well, how would you and I fit into that situation? That's a sobering one to think about, isn't it? Would we just kind of be on the sidelines thinking, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go up against this guy. That's not my place. I'm not a soldier. I'm not, the most powerful. Don't pick me. Or would we have been someone more like David that, well, God is with us, so I'm going to do this. Nobody else is going to do it. I'm going to do it. It's a pretty sobering thing, really, to think about. And also, when trying to think about putting yourself in that situation, I can't help but also think, this isn't just David and Goliath and King Saul over there on the side watching on. I mean, we're talking about the armies of Israel. We're talking about the armies of the Philistines. Everybody's gathered around, the very best of the Philistines, the very best of the Israelite army. And here you are, here I am, just in the midst of all of this, a nobody, not somebody who's a great warrior or anybody of any significance and importance. Just little David. What would you have thought about all of that? It doesn't seem like it phases David in the least as he sets out to do this thing. But I can't help but think about, maybe for me, maybe even for you, that may have played a factor in that. what's all these people thinking? What if I fail? What if I'm not able to accomplish this? What if I let everybody down? Would I have been so bold as to do what David does? Would I have been so confident to take that on? Certainly an interesting thing for us to think about as we try to put ourselves in that situation. Would we have been able to sling that stone at Goliath and ultimately be victorious because of our faith in God and our reliance upon Him? And the last example I want to mention comes from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 14. This is the story where Peter walks on the water. Again, another familiar passage of Scripture. Matthew chapter 14, Jesus has just finished feeding the 5,000. He encourages the disciples to get in the boat and go to the other side while he goes to the mountain to pray. And we're told that that's what takes place. He's there praying alone. The boat is already quite a ways away, and it's not calm and peaceful, but rather it's being battered by waves. We're told the wind is contrary in verse 24. Well, it's the fourth watch of the night, verse 25 says, which is around 3 to 6 o'clock in the morning in that range. And so here comes Jesus walking on the water, and the disciples think they're seeing a ghost. They can't believe what they're seeing. They cry out for fear. Verse 26 talks about. But Jesus tells them that it's him. Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid. And so Peter says in verse 28, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. That would be exciting, wouldn't it? Here comes the Lord walking on the water. It's kind of rough out, but there's the Lord. He's come out there. And I want to go out on the water too. That would be great as I'm sitting in the boat watching. I want to come out there also. And so that's what he does. He gets out of the boat and he walks on the water, verse 29, and comes towards Jesus. Everything's good, right? Well, verse 30 rather. But seeing the wind, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he cries out, saying, Lord, save me. Why would he do that? Why did he just keep on walking? Why didn't he just keep looking at Jesus and have those warm, happy thoughts that he was having before? Well, if you've ever been out on a boat and had any kind of wind or storm, most of the time when I take Lauren out with me, we either have a hailstorm or lightning, or she's in the water somehow. But it can be a scary thing whenever there's a storm that comes up out on the water, and that's what's taking place here. Yet Peter still goes out to meet the Lord, but then all of a sudden, well, now you're surrounded with all these waves and the wind blowing. You're looking around at things other than just Jesus there walking. And of course, he starts doubting and starts sinking in the process. But just think about that as we're talking about this particular event. What about you? What about me? Would we have had the kind of faith, not only to say, can I, Lord, but to actually get out there on the water with him? And then let alone, what would we have done when we were out there? Would we have been as good as Peter, or would we have even got out of the boat? Would we have gone all the way to the Lord and not had a problem, or would we have began to sink as well? It's a pretty sobering thing, again, to think about. Would we have walked on the water? Would we have just stayed in the boat and never even thought about asking the question? Or maybe we're somewhere in the middle there. But it does make us think about our faith, our focus, and where we should be living. All of these things are meant to do that very thing tonight as we're talking about the faith of some of these individuals in this study, and looking at some of the specific storylines that are familiar in the scriptures. But how can we not take away from this thinking about our own relationship with God and really considering how great is our faith? Do we have that faith like Noah had to build the ark, or like Abraham in leaving the city of his birth, or the kind of faith that Joshua and Caleb had in taking a stand for what God had said and promised versus all those that were opposed? Would we have had that kind of faith? Or faith like David and taking on impossible odds and against what anybody thought possible and reasonable to defeat Goliath? Or faith like Peter, to get out of the boat even in a storm when you see Jesus and go over to him. The point of all of these stories, of course, and the reason why so many kinds of lessons like this are mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, the great chapter of faith, is to show us that these are not just people that are unrelatable or that we could never hope to attain, but it is to show us that we likewise can have a great faith. We can be faithful people to God. These people are not outliers that we could never possibly hope to have the kind of faith that they have. They did have great faith, but as the Hebrew writer talks about, so can we. So could the people in his day. We can have that kind of faith and trust in the Lord to do what he says. We can have the kind of faith that is pleasing to him. As the Hebrew writer said in chapter 11 and verse 6, without faith, it's impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. We have to have faith. And so, that's something for us to consider in our own journey of faith, where we're at, who it is we're living for. Are we striving for eternity? Are we looking forward to heaven? What is it that is our priority? And that's certainly something that all of us need to reflect on and think about as we each consider our own walk of faith in this life. In our life, we may never face anything even close to the stories and situations we've talked about tonight. There may not be a mirror image in your life or my life of some of these examples. But we will have challenges. We will have difficulties. We will have problems in our life. And so it is comparable in many ways to how we face those challenges, how we face the things that we encounter even day by day as we consider how we're living, who we're living for, what our priority really is in life. And the point is, we can have the same kind of faith, although not facing maybe the same sort of challenges, but we can have the same kind of faith that we read about. The question for us is, again, how great is our faith? Are we willing to have that kind of faith and trust in God? He wants us to. He wants us to rely on him. He's given us all the tools that we need to be successful. He wants us to be with him in heaven for eternity. And he's made it possible for us to do that. So I'd encourage you tonight as we conclude this evening to think about your life as I think about my life. Think about the example that we set, the faith that we have, and what our priorities really are. If you're not a Christian, it starts by becoming one, by putting him on in baptism, by being a part of his family. No, all your problems don't go away. Everything doesn't just disappear except for your faith then. But we are in that relationship with the Lord. We have his help. We have his word. We have one another to help us during the difficult times in our life. And more importantly, and maybe the most important, we have that hope of heaven. And we look forward to that after this life is over. We have something to look forward to, something that we can rely on and have confidence in for our future. If you are a Christian but have not been living the right kind of life, we urge you to get your life right this very evening. If we can help in any way, please let it be known by coming forward and say that we stand and sing.
Number 604, as we sing this song, let's think about what we would have done at Jesus' crucifixion.